Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Humanities in Action. Who is this masked person in front of you? My name is Max Zorey. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's Humanities in Action talk, Public Universities and American Democracy. Before we begin, I'd like to thank a few of our sponsors, the Cotton Merca Group and Morgan Stanley, who have been working with us for a number of years, especially supporting our K-12 programs. I'd like to thank Carolina Meadows, a retirement community in Chapel Hill, longtime partners with us promoting these programs here, our Adventures and Ideas seminars, and also recently come on as a sponsor of our K-12 programs, and a very special partner, the General Alumni Association, with whom we're partnering this semester for a whole host of online programs. So we do hope that you check out the GA, become a member. We're offering discounts for members of the GA for all of our programming, well, all of our programming that qualifies for it, and certainly are thankful for everything the General Alumni Association has done for us in publicizing our programs. A special organization and group of people we'd like to thank are Flyleaf Books. We are here in Flyleaf Books where normally we would be with Humanities in Action. I'm going to pretend that we are seeing 50 to 60 dear friends that are now online with us. Normally we do Humanities in Action here, but it's so nice to be able to use this space as a studio. It feels like we're back a little bit in the normal world. Flyleaf Books has been partnering with us on all sorts of programs this fall. I'd just like to mention a few of their opportunities for engagement coming up. Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, the authors of a book on reparations from here to equality, will be giving a special talk next Thursday, September 24th. So we I hope you go to flyleafbooks.com and check that out. And remember, Flyleaf Books is still open. And guess what they have here? A lot of books. And they're doing brisk sales. The floor is not open, but you can order online or by calling up. And there's sales on cookbooks and art books and all sorts of wonder. I'm surrounded by books, and I couldn't be happier. And I want to thank Flyleaf Books for their great support this fall. I also want to bring your attention to humanities.unc.edu, although we are not doing our live events like we do, and we're missing all of you. Our weekend seminars are still going. They're going online, and usually not on the weekend. But for example, we have Dictators all next week, Adventures and Ideas with Dr. Richard Talbert, Anna Krylova from Duke University. I'll be giving a talk on Napoleon, and Miguel Lacerna on Latin American dictatorship. Should be a really fascinating week studying this issue of authoritarian power and democracy and the relationships between them. Also, a seminar coming up on elections. We're looking at historic elections, 1800, 1860, and 1968. And we just want to remind folks that this is not the first time that America has been heavily polarized, and maybe we could learn some lessons by going and reviewing those past elections. That's coming up in October. Our dear friend Bart Ehrman will be giving an encore of Heaven and Hell coming up in November. Maybe some of us will feel by the time early November comes around, we will be either living in one of those two places. But Bart Ehrman will tell us how this ties into Christian theology, and of course, always fascinating. I want to remind folks about our musical event on October 24th. But also, a wonderful series, our great books. We still have a few room in some of our great books reading groups, our language lunches, and our new biography series done in partnership with the General Alumni Association starts off next week. We'll actually be starting with our dear friend Lloyd Kramer and the biography of Marquis de Lafayette. But check that out. Great people on that. Billie Jean King, Leonid Brezhnev, Ida B. Wells, people that you don't always necessarily throw together in the same sentence, but they're all in our biography series. So please go to humanities.unc.edu, line up, sign up, and get involved. Finally, I want to just encourage you folks to realize that for all the work that we're doing for these live public programs, we are continuing to do work with our community colleges and with our K-12 teachers and doing extensive workshops. We really appreciate those that have joined up and paid a ticket price to attend today's talk, but we encourage you to consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities to help us in these initiatives. There are a whole lot of people out there who are very hungry for academic content and engagement with UNC faculty, and you can help us make sure we can do that through our K-12 programs and community colleges. So follow the link there on the giving, and we really do appreciate that. I also now I want to get right to the order of business at hand, and that is to just thank our our guest here today, Humanities in Action. We were going to do this talk in the normal time, but everything changes and everything shifts. So here we are in Flyleaf Books, bringing our dear friend, Dr. Andrew Perrin. He's a Ruel Tyson Distinguished Professor of the Humanities, Professor of Sociology as well, and very important for us, he's the director for the Institute for Arts and Humanities, a great partner with us in normal times for our Humanities Happy Hours. We'll get that going again when we can all be gathered together. What we really love about Andy Perrin's work, though, he has always been able to apply the social scientist view with the humanities sensibility, and his ability to kind of look at how the public university is so important to democracy, what it's meant for democracy in the past, and what stresses it's under right now, and what we can maybe hopefully do in the future. We had a really nice preliminary talk on Monday on our radio show, but I'm very excited to learn more from Dr. Perrin today. We've put his biography in the chat column there if you'd like to find out more about Dr. Perrin or perhaps contact him. I'll let him decide whether he responds or not. But there it is for you folks. And without further ado, let's get right to the business at hand and welcome Dr. Andrew Perrin as he brings us public universities and American democracy. Come on over, Andy. We don't shake hands.
Max, thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to Carolina Public Humanities. I, for years, have loved the kind of work that you all do. We're thrilled to partner with you at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And I'm excited to talk today about some areas of my current research, which are questions about the relationship between two things I hold very dear, and those are public universities and American democracy. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about each of them and about the relationship between the two. Some of this conversation will be about UNC Chapel Hill in particular, and others will be about the general concept, the general institution of American public universities. Let me begin, though, with a quick disclaimer, which is to say that I don't speak for UNC in any official way. I've worked here at Carolina for 19 years. I've come to really deeply love this place for all of its faults and for all of its successes. And if there's a controversy that's happened at Carolina over those last 19 years, there's a pretty good chance I've been involved in it, or at least have some kind of opinion about it one way or the other. So I'm thrilled to speak about Carolina, but I do not represent Carolina in any official way. I am now, as Max said, the director of the wonderful Institute for the Arts and Humanities, which is, I think, the best place on campus. And I'm also heading the university's new efforts at renewing democracy, one of the pillars of the Carolina Next strategic plan. And so I'll be telling you a little bit about that process as well. I want to start, though, a little bit further back in history. And mention that in the American tradition in particular, the way that we do academia, the way we do universities, and in particular the way we do the humanities, has long been deeply tied with the American democratic tradition. And here I'm going to draw upon a book, a relatively recent book by Jeffrey Galt Harpham, the former director of the National Humanities Center in RTP, and actually now a professor at that other private school up the road from us. And Harpham examines the literary tradition in American higher education, as well as the more recent 20th century emphasis on merit-based access to education. And he argues that these two together form a powerful intellectual framework for the educated, not just the informed citizen. And I'm going to return to that idea in a moment. That when they're firing on all cylinders, what universities do for us, and what in particular public universities do for us, is they help people be not just informed, but educated. And that this kind of humanities style education actually helps students, what Harpham shows is it actually helps students to become to develop the skills at understanding texts and understanding how texts work in history that are part and parcel of good American citizenship. For the first century plus of American higher education, in fact, employability and economic development were at most tertiary concerns to the American university. You would not have had an Office of Career Services, and you would not have had students or their parents worrying about the jobs they would attain following college education. Certainly for the first century plus of American higher education was designed to produce young gentlemen who would be ready to reproduce the level of sort of elite privilege that their parents had born them into. It was, in fact, to put a bit of a gloss on the history, it was, in fact, the Morrill Act of 1862, which established the land-grant universities, that actually formed this tie, the tie between higher education and employability. And interestingly enough, on the one hand, you could argue it sort of reduces this sort of esoteric intellectualism that characterized higher education prior to that. But on the other hand, it also dramatically increased the number of public universities and therefore also the access young Americans had to higher education. So the first big shift, the first shift that I want to trace as we think about the role public universities have played is the Morrill Act. Now, let me point out that, in fact, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is not a land-grant university. Chapel Hill was one of relatively few public universities founded prior to the land-grant the land-grant Act, the Morrill Act. And, in fact, North Carolina's land-grant university is North Carolina State University in Raleigh. The other piece of literature I want to build upon as we think about what the relationship is between public universities and higher education is this wonderful book by Michael Schudson called The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life. Schudson points out that what we now idealize as the right way to be a good citizen, that is, to be an informed citizen, that right way of doing citizenship, of enacting good citizenship, would never have come into the imaginations of the American founders. That it actually is through the co-development of American democracy and American higher education that we arrived at an idea that honestly is more like a sort of post-World War II understanding of citizenship. That to be a good citizen is to understand what's going on, to be informed on the issues, whatever that set of things called the issues is, to understand which ones matter and what side one falls upon, and then should vote for and represent their own interests in the public sphere. Again, that idea that we take as commonplace, and indeed when I teach a first-year seminar right now, in fact, and every election fall called Citizenship and Society in the United States, and when I ask the students what's the most important thing to do as a citizen, what they say is to be an informed voter. One must always vote, and one must always do so on the basis of information. That common sense emerged from the co-development of American democracy and the American university over the course of that first couple of centuries, and it became commonplace only by the middle of the 20th century. So given that background, I want to suggest one important thing here, and that is that fundamentally democracy is an intellectual project. That's the tie, right? So I'm asking you on the one hand to talk about the history and practice of American democracy. On the other hand, I want you to talk about public universities and education. The tie between the two that I'm going to argue is that as we practice it now, or as we idealize it now, democracy is an intellectual project. And so the question that we need to be able to answer as university people, as university leaders and educators, is what skills, knowledge, dispositions, and commitments should people have in order to be good citizens and leaders? And we can think about these, I think, in a number of different pieces. The first is people should have a set of values and principles upon which they base deliberation, public engagement, right? They should have a sense of what is important and what they're seeking to pursue. And ideally, we'd hope that those values and principles in some way go beyond simple individual self-interest. Number two, people need to have a sense of information, evidence, and media literacy. Now, media literacy on its own, I actually think is not particularly useful. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but I'm going to tell you why in a moment. Media literacy on its own is important, but far from sufficient. That in fact, perhaps most important is people need the capacities, the skills, and the tendencies to approach big public questions by bringing evidence to them. Evidence doesn't always mean statistics, it doesn't always mean data from a numerical standpoint, but that answering questions with evidence, instead of answering them with a whole host of other kinds of much more personalist approaches, that's key to successful public deliberation, and, interestingly enough, it is a fundamental skill of university life. People need to be able to listen and communicate across differences. Right? They need to be able to listen to those they disagree with, and also to speak carefully and thoroughly to those with whom they have big differences. In fact, if I know the kinds of audiences that are likely to be here at Carolina Public Humanities, the chances are that most of you think two different things that are kind of maybe not in conflict, but they're difficult. One is that people ought to listen to and carefully consider the opinions of others, and two is that the people you disagree with, honestly, they're really misinformed and stupid, and they probably shouldn't be paying attention to you anyway. Now, those two things, you probably honestly believe both of them. I gotta say, I honestly believe both of them. The two of them are in conflict, and so we have to be able to figure out how to manage them. And again, good intellectual life is the way that we manage the two of them together. Another piece of that is the formation of good judgment, right? We talked about evidence, but evidence doesn't interpret itself. Evidence helps us build arguments and build interpretations, and those are good judgments. And so coming to good judgment based on evidence and observation, that's a crucial democratic skill, as is, I think, if there's one thing I think is most important in the entire college curriculum, it's the development of this concept called intellectual humility. You can think about intellectual humility as being the idea that I actually might be wrong, that the judgment I've reached could be incorrect. I actually think intellectual humility is the single most important thing that students should learn in college, and I think it's a key democratic capacity. And then finally, I think people need to develop moral courage and commitment. These are the things that give you the tendency and the skills and the approaches to stand up when something's wrong, when you disagree, and make that disagreement known. So, and I think one of the concerns people have raised is that students maybe are too committed these days. Maybe they're intolerant because of their level of commitment. I don't think that commitment and tolerance are opposed to one another. I think being committed to things that are important and right, I think, is an important democratic skill as well. All of these, again, emerge from a great education. They emerge from a great engagement with intellectual life. Now, I want to focus for a second on the question of communication across difference, because I do think that's one of the really, truly key intellectual skills that are important for democratic life. And I've argued in my 2014, I have a book I wrote in 2014 called American Democracy, From Tocqueville to Town Halls to Twitter. Some have argued that perhaps a book called American Democracy now looks more like historical fiction. But nonetheless, in that book, I argued that we should think about 4 goals for effective communication across difference. Most of you probably think that that communication with people we disagree with ought to be civil, and I agree, civility is good stuff. But I actually think it needs to be balanced against the goal of frankness. That if you have to choose between the two, if you can't be both civil and frank, it's more important to be frank. It's more important to be able to express a concern and get it across than it is to be civil in doing so. And in fact, I think one of the practices that tends to silence people who are relatively powerless is the argument that those who are angry are being uncivil and that they should therefore not be listened to. So that's one dimension. The other dimension I think is really important is the dimension of accuracy. Like, we want things that we say in the public sphere, important public questions, to be accurate. If they're inaccurate, that's probably a problem. But we actually, perhaps more importantly, we want that accuracy to be thorough. That is, it needs to be set in context in a useful way. The accuracy needs to be understood not as we might call a factoid, but actually as a piece of a broader set of evidence. And I think if you look at some of the information, the studies about how social media happens, in particular how public debate happens on Twitter, the problem is not so much that it's inaccurate as that it's not thorough. that the little bits of information that people present in Twitter tend to be misleading, not because they're inaccurate, but because their accuracy is not thorough enough. And so thinking then again about communication across difference, about where and when this kind of stuff happens. I'm using here, by the way, one of my favorite paintings. This is Norman Rockwell's painting, Freedom of Speech, part of his Four Freedoms series, and I love that. There's a whole bunch of things you can say about the aesthetics of this painting and how it represents our idea about speaking truth to power and about the value of the sort of the everyday talk. But what I want to say is that there are two conditions for good communication across difference that are, I think, all too lacking in our contemporary public sphere, and that universities can provide opportunities to help to solve. The first of these is the physical space, what we could also call an agora space in the Greek philosophical tradition. And the physical space, particularly nowadays, right, when none of us is allowed to be in physical space with anybody else, right, that agora space is what has particularly suffered from coronavirus restrictions, right? Because now you can have conversations with anybody, but you got to know first whom you're going to have those conversations with. Right? And so the agora space, the opportunity to bump into someone, have a conversation, encounter speech you find difficult, encounter opinions that you don't like, encounter new information, right? That's what's missing, particularly from coronavirus. But the truth it was missing before too, right? That the opportunity for us to have either physical or virtual spaces in which people could encounter the unexpected or the unknown has been in decline for a long time, and it's a big part of the problem for engagement across difference. The other is the question of emotional state, right? It turns out that most people, when we look at the experimental evidence in experimental psychology and in political science, most people are actually able to deliberate with people they disagree with, meaning they're able to listen carefully, they're able to reproduce the arguments of their opponents, and they're able to get across their opinions in a civil, frank, and relatively accurate, relatively thorough way. But they do so when we've set them up to do so, when we've created an emotional state in which the stakes are low enough that those people are not particularly worried about having to win the argument. In the real world, the emotional stakes feel really high. Democracy is at stake. American values are at stake. You either love America or you hate it. If you don't have borders, you don't have a country. Everything feels emotionally fraught. And when people feel scared, when they feel that they're insecure, those are the opportunities that they take to be more authoritarian, to be less tolerant, to listen less well, and to make arguments based on their sense of personal insecurity more than the deliberative state we'd like them to be in. So two things universities can do to help contribute to this. I'll talk about that in specific in a few minutes, but they can help create the spaces in which people engage with those they disagree with, engage across difference, both for students and for the general public. And two, they can help to give people an emotional support, emotional floor, so that they can be in an emotional state where they can listen well and consider others' opinions. All right, so that's the ideal. Is this really happening? Well, let me tell you a little bit about what you might have seen in the media. And the chances are, my particular sort of favorite thing to pick on is the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which has a really specific idea about what's going on in the media, in higher education. But honestly, across the board, the media have a really narrow view of what higher education is. It's mostly either medical science, maybe scientific research, and undergraduate education. And it's mostly the biggest, most exciting, most important sort of high-profile things going on those campuses. So, like, chances are you've heard something going on at Yale, maybe Harvard, right? Columbia, Stanford, right? The incredibly elite, incredibly expensive, incredibly small portion of the higher education world gathers an enormous portion of the attention from the media as they talk about higher education. You may find one of these every once in a while, right? These universities are the public flagships, right? Carolina's in there, Rutgers, Nebraska, Kentucky, Michigan. My PhD alma mater, Cal, is not there, which I'm not sure why I chose this this particular logo, given that they've got UCLA and not Cal, which is particularly problematic. But nonetheless, we might hear about these. This set of institutions educates an inordinately higher number of students than does the Harvard, Yale, Stanford group of them. But these too are highly selective institutions, and they represent a particular segment of the university market. I'm going to bracket, by the way, entirely bracket athletics for now, although we can talk about athletics if you want in the Q&A. But if you think about how universities, make it into the media, they make it in the media when there's big controversy, or they make it in the media because of the constant coverage of university athletics. All right, so if you're looking at that, that's kind of your universe of institutions making it into the media. And then what are we mostly finding out? Well, we're mostly hearing that students these days are incredibly intolerant, that left-wing intolerant students are bashing free speech with a banner of tolerance. Right, that's most of what we're going to hear about politics and engagement on campuses. And this is another case of the same thing, right? This is the protests at Middlebury College when Charles Murray came to give his famous talk. All right, so on the one hand, there's all these great things universities can do for democracy. On the other hand, when we look at how they're mostly portrayed, we mostly get this. Let me talk to you just briefly about the point that I made a moment ago. This is public versus private college enrollment through 2018 in the United States. And I just want you to see the bottom line is the one you can mostly not pay attention to at all, because that's the number of students enrolled in private for-profit colleges in the United States. And you shouldn't not pay attention to it at all, but you should not think about it in the same way as we think about these other two categories of colleges and universities. In fact, a wonderful sociologist, Tressie McMillan Cottom, who's just joined the Carolina faculty this summer, wrote a wonderful book called Lower Education, which is explicitly about private for-profit colleges. So you should listen to Tressie about this, and then we can talk about the other two lines. That middle line, which is hovering right around 2 million students, right, that's private nonprofit colleges and universities. Yes, that's your Harvards and Yales and Princetons. It's also, for those around here, it's your Elons and your Catawbas and your Guilfords and your Warren Wilson. So it's a large number of colleges and universities around the country. In general, more of them in the Northeast. There's many more of them just happen to be in the Northeast than elsewhere. And the ones at the elite top that we were talking about, those are doing fine. But there's actually a major enrollment crisis in that next set of those colleges, largely because the quality of education at public universities has gone up, and the costs of tuition at private universities have gone up. And so it's becoming harder and harder for second and third tier private colleges to make the case that parents should spend the money on them instead of on the public universities in their states. But then that purple line very much at the top of the graph, which as you can see now is right around 13 million students. So about 6.5 times the number of students educated right now in private nonprofits are educated in public universities. And these are all degree-granting public post-secondary institutions. And so once again, yes, these are that set that I showed you before with Carolina and Michigan and inexplicably not Cal in the list. But it's also your smaller and regional public universities. There are, of course, 17 campuses in the UNC system. And it's your community colleges. So that's the universe of these public enrollments. But I just want to show you that if there's no other reason, even if there's no other reason to think about public universities and democracy, the sheer size of public universities makes them a much more important place to look for democratic culture and education than private universities. When we start to look at access to public versus private colleges, it gets even more stark. For four-year colleges, that's the graph on the right. And this is the number of Pell-eligible students, which that's just a measure of students who are eligible for Pell grants, which is a low and moderate income families eligibility. And you can see here, right, that the private nonprofit sector enrolls about I want to make sure I count my zeros right here. It looks like about 1 million Pell-eligible students in 2017 to 18, but it's about 30 million in the public university market. So once again, access is the key here. And looking at, of course, my very favorite public university here, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Right now, or whenever in the last year or two, about 22% low-income students, which is more than the vast majority of elite universities. We're fourth nationally in the graduation rate of Pell Grant recipients. We're at 86% of the graduation rate, which the only three institutions ahead of us, interestingly enough, are in the University of California system. They're Berkeley, UC Irvine, and UCLA. In the entering class of 2015, we had 1,021 first-generation students and 1,167 Pell Grant eligible students, which is about the same as Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, and Dartmouth combined. Our one institution at UNC Chapel Hill. So to give you a sense, again, the value of public universities in increasing access, even, let's face it, a relatively elite public university like UNC Chapel Hill. And I do think one of the reasons I love Chapel Hill so much is that it's right at that intersection between academic excellence and access to low-income students. All right, but here's the picture, and here's part of the problem. This is state appropriations this is state appropriations for UNC Chapel Hill, and the blue line is straightforward state appropriations, and the red line is state appropriations per undergrad, and this runs through 2016. So this is prior to, obviously, anything that's happened recently with regard to COVID. As you can see, the appropriations from the state per undergrad have dropped quite substantially just in the period following 2008 and the 2008 financial crisis, and they did not recover in the years following the financial crisis. The recession that tore apart the country and the state in 2008 stayed for higher education. And then, predictably enough, in-state tuition and fees at Carolina have gone up in just the same period of time. Carolina is still a great value. We're very proud of that. I'm very proud of that. But why is tuition going up? Tuition's going up because state appropriations are going down. It really is that simple. And so this question about access is directly related to this question about state support. All right, so that's a picture of where we are. State universities in general, their importance, how many students they educate, and also the I think misplacement of some of the high-profile sort of anti-free speech stories in the press with regard to higher education. I want to then shift, therefore, to talk about what universities ought to be doing for free speech, for free association, and for safe spaces, and talk about these things. These are hot button words, right? If I say safe spaces and you're one kind of person, you're likely to think, oh my gosh, safe spaces are anti-free speech. If I say free speech, you're likely to think, well, I'm in favor of hate speech, right? That these have become caricatured positions. Let's calm it down a little bit, change that emotional state, and think through a little bit about each of these in a more careful way. The first point I want to make is that different spaces within universities have different goals, right? It's appropriate for all students to have spaces in which they feel safe, in which their ideas are not challenged all the time. Not because that should be true of the entire university by any means, but the idea that every single moment, every student has to be challenged in defending their ideas, I think is silly, right? Different pieces of the university have different goals. And when students are out if you know Carolina, if they're out on the pit and they're marching and they're protesting, right, that's one kind of speech. That's a different kind of speech from what ought to be in classrooms, right, where we have a higher standard for evidence, a higher standard for being careful about what you're saying, not because you don't want to offend someone, but because in the classroom and in research and in inquiry, we care about telling the truth, being careful, submitting arguments to evidence, right? So different spaces have different goals. And bringing in people from the outside, right, having external speakers is one of those kinds of spaces. But let's not pretend that's the only kind of speech that goes on college campuses. Number two, free speech is a beginning, not an end, right? Universities, we have experts on every single area that we can possibly have, essentially, across the university. Universities ought to be adding value to speech, not just hosting it. If people come to campus and say stupid things, they ought to be called on those stupid things. That's not a violation of free speech. That's value added. That's what universities ought to be able to do. Now, I got to tell you, speakers that I agree with and speakers that I disagree with have said some pretty stupid things in the 19 years I've been at Carolina. My personal little idea here, and who knows if we could ever do this, my personal idea is that every speaker coming to campus is offered the opportunity to have a faculty expert offer an evidence-based response to their talk before the question and answer session. So the faculty expert would be paid a little bit of money to sit there and listen to the talk and offer some evidence-based responses to the talk. I think that does a couple things. Number one, it disciplines the speaker. Says, I better not say something stupid because the faculty expert's going to call me on it. And number two, again, it's value added. You don't just see what you could have seen this person say on Fox News or MSNBC and they just come and they say the same thing in Memorial Hall. Instead, you force them into a university-style engagement with evidence and difference. That's my little idea. Free speech is a beginning, not an end. Now, I also think it is true that all people, this is back to the emotional state point, all people should be and feel safe, right? So can we really object to the idea of safe spaces, right? That universities ought to be, in fact, safe spaces? All people should, in fact, be and feel safe. But no idea should be safe from critique, right? No idea is safe from critique. All people are safe. No ideas are safe. Now, this whole free speech thing, particularly for outside speakers, a few things to say. One, there's all kinds of questions about what political scientists call agenda setting. Who gets to set the invitation? Who gets to make invitation? Who pays for it? Who responds to it? And so I think it's important that we balance moral courage and commitment with points about listening, about judgment, and importantly, about intellectual humility. Now, one of the most commonly discussed figures in this debate is Charles Murray, a sociologist, a conservative sociologist who's made a number of arguments, including the very famous and largely debunked book from 1994, The Bell Curve. And the example, again, if you go to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, you're going to hear about how intolerant students have shouted down Charles Murray and they've prevented him from speaking. It's a violation of free speech. And the truth is, at the Middlebury case where that happened, it was, in fact, a violation of free speech. As a sociologist, there's all sorts of things I would love to do to try and respond to Murray in the register of good evidence to show that, indeed, his science is simply bad. That's more fun, it's more productive, and it's ultimately a better way to do it. So no, the students at Middlebury should not have shouted it down. But it turns out that the same year that Murray talked at Middlebury and was shouted down, I counted, he gave nearly 24 campus lectures around the country in the same year as those highly publicized Middlebury protests. And at most of them, there were no contests, there were certainly no shutting down. And so let's pay attention to the denominator as well. There are very few sociologists giving 24 lectures around the country, and most of them going uncontested. And the reason why I want to pay attention to this, in addition to simply correcting the record, is that I do think that we can be concerned about overcommitment. right? We can be concerned about this idea that some students are really, they're too angry, they're too shutting down of speech, they're too commitment to their concern. But the truth is that there's another problem on college campuses as well, and that's the problem of apathy. That most students are unwilling to commit strongly to any particular moral or political position, right? And in fact, it can feel sort of passé to them or uncool to be too committed to any particular moral position. So I actually think we have two problems to solve at once in campus free speech and in classrooms in the university. One problem is this problem of intolerance and of not listening well. But honestly, the bigger problem is the problem of apathy, of the claim that, or the implied claim that all positions are essentially equal, that it's totally fine to kind of argue whichever direction you want or to believe whatever you want, that essentially political positions are kind of like tastes in food. And just as when we had a dining hall, just as when you go to the dining hall, you might one day choose heaven forbid, Chick-fil-A, and another day you might choose the Chinese food. If one day you argue for greater immigration, and the next day you argue against immigration, you can wear those kind of like you wear tastes in food. I think that's honestly a bigger danger to developing students as good citizens than is the relatively minor, although loud, intolerance that we hear on college campuses. There's actually, if I've established that there are these two different threats, I actually think the two threats come together. And the two threats come together in the biggest threat I think we actually face in college campuses with respect to producing and developing good citizens. And that threat is anti-intellectualism. It's an old style in American politics. If you know the work of the historian Richard Hofstadter, right, he wrote about anti-intellectualism as a core kind of style of American political culture. Well, we get anti-intellectualism all the time. And as I argued, perhaps the origin of this on college campuses is the moral acts argument that universities could be essentially about practical matters. They could be essentially about preparing people for the economy, for workplaces. I'm not arguing the moral act is a bad thing, but I'm pointing out that it emerged from this. And we get this throughout the time since then. There's questions about relevance, about job readiness, utilitarian views about how universities ought to work and what they ought to do for students. These are essentially anti-intellectual views because they seek to make things less complicated when arguably what universities ought to be doing is preserving and honoring the complexity of life. The truth is that liberals and conservatives both do this. I can rattle off lots of different offices, lots of different things that liberals have argued for that are essentially anti-intellectual ways of using the university. Certainly in the 1960s, the arguments for relevance were essentially anti-intellectual arguments, and they persist to this day. Here's the thing. Universities ought to be, again, if we think about this question of intellectual humility, we think about sort of the value of complexity itself as being a democratic value, intellectual habits of mind that universities ought to be inculcating. They're inefficient, they're difficult, they're frustrating, but they're also fulfilling, and in a sort of backhanded way, they're useful. People who think in complicated ways are better. They're not better morally. They're better at citizenship. They're also better in the workplace. They're also better in families, and frankly, they're people that you'd have more fun hanging out with as well, right? So the biggest threat that universities face, I actually think, is anti-intellectualism, and that anti-intellectualism is expressed both as the intolerance that we hear about and as the lack of commitment in the classroom that I've argued is the bigger problem. All right, now, I told you, I'm a Carolina fan. I think Carolina is the best public university in the country. I think we do great things for our students. And so I want to tell you a little bit about ways that we are trying at Carolina to do a good job in this space. And the first of these, I'm going to take some credit for. Before my current job as the head of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, I chaired the committee that developed the new undergraduate curriculum, which we'll be implementing in the next couple of years. It's called the Ideas in Action Curriculum, and IDEAS stands for identify, explore, decide, and apply. Right, so you can see these ideas in actually how we want students to engage with their general education experience at Carolina. And part of the idea, as you can see in the logo here, is that students do these things and they become better prepared for all the pieces of their lives. That instead of trying to block out certain courses students are going to take for employability, other courses they'll take in order to be ready to be good citizens or good lifelong learners. If we can produce students to develop intellectual habits of mind, we think that they're going to be better at successful careers and better at engaged public life, good citizens, and they're going to be more ready for lifelong learning going forward. So that's the theory behind the Ideas in Action curriculum. We want students to be able to identify big questions, good questions to ask. They can do this through experience. They can do it through observation. They can do it by noticing things as they move through the world. But we want them to identify big, interesting questions, problems, issues in the world. Then we want them to think about those as things to explore, not just things to note. Right? So exploring those means listening to others about them. It means collecting information, right, and collecting data, collecting evidence, and investigating them somehow. We're actively involved with trying not just to notice big things, but actually to answer them. Then we want them to form good judgments. It's not enough to simply have collected the data. We have to find ways to get students to make good judgments, to come to good conclusions, to understand and synthesize evidence and ideas from lots of different directions, and finally to apply that. When you're acting in the world, whether you're acting as an employee, whether you're acting as a professional, or you're acting as a citizen or a community leader, we want you to be doing so on top of that evidentiary base that you've developed by asking great questions and bringing good evidence to it. That's the Ideas in Action curriculum. And our argument, and I'm proud of it for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons I'm proud of it is that it doesn't take shortcuts. That this curriculum asks students to develop those complicated intellectual habits of mind. And if we combine this with the access that I showed you before, we are giving students a great set of tools for approaching the world as they come out as young adults and continue into the world that will be super helpful to them and I think super helpful to the public in developing good democracy. We're doing more than that as well. I told you about Carolina Next. Carolina Next is the name for the university's strategic plan, which is just starting to be developed now, or not developed, it's developed, starting to come into practice now. And one of the pillars of Carolina Next, the strategic plan, is promote democracy. I can't speak to this fully, but I don't know of another university's strategic plan in which the promotion, the service to democracy is front and center in the way that ours is. Carolina Next calls for the university to put its full resources behind the goal of actively engaging as diverse citizens responsible for the institutions of American democracy. This, by the way, is not just students. It's important for students to do so, but also for staff, for faculty, for our alumni, for other members of our community. It calls on us to find ways to help people work constructively across differences in our democracy, particularly starting by promoting respect and listening, right? To try to make Carolina a place where those conversations happen well. And then finally, as a research institution, Carolina Next asks us to explore how humanity's highest purposes and potential are realized in democracy and can help the democracy thrive. And we are doing this we're building these programs over the next 5 years in relationship with other pieces of Carolina Next, including the Build Community Together goal, which is to bring diversity and inclusion truly to the center of Carolina's activities. That's an essential democratic skill as well. We're in close collaboration with UNC Global, trying to understand how democracy as a worldwide phenomenon works and how interaction works at that level as well. So to wrap up then, let me just finish the conversation by pointing out that we have two crucial institutions of American society. One is the public university, which has co-developed alongside American democracy, and that the production not just of education, but of discourse, of dialogue, of conversation, of free speech, of universities as public universities in particular as anchors of their communities makes them key feeders of the skills, the styles, the habits of a democratic culture that I think will be most necessary for redeveloping American democracy going forward. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Perrin. That was fantastic, and I'm glad we got you some water there. If you need more, let me know. I'll get you some more water over from the fountain. We do have some questions coming up, and I want to start with a question that was actually fed to me before the thing even began. I had a question from our good friend Bill Harrington, who you sort of addressed this, I certainly earlier on when you were talking in one of your slides, but I guess it's sort of asking for a summary of it. I'll read the question. What, as specifically as possible, is critical thinking? How is critical thinking taught? And without further education beyond high school, can one think critically? I think you did engage a little bit on that, but could maybe summarize for Bill what we're talking about when we say critical thinking, and is it possible without further education beyond high school?
Sure. Bill, thank you for that. I appreciate the question. A lot of different directions to go with that. One of them is different disciplines think about critical thinking differently. The people in the sort of school of education world, for whom they're paying closest attention to sort of what does it mean to educate for critical thinking, I think it most closely adapts to or most closely matches the idea of intellectual humility combined with the adherence to and consideration of evidence. So when one thinks critically, one is inclined to believe that one could be wrong and to be able to use and engage with evidence to figure out if one is wrong. Now, I'm using that inflection because it's the inflection I prefer, and I'm the one you asked to come give the talk. There are folks who would think about it, who think about critical as criticism, and I think there's an important distinction between the two, but there are folks for whom they think critical thinking means critiquing, like offering a critique of an institution, expectation, belief, etc. I think if we actually limit it to fealty to evidence and intellectual humility, those are two things that go an awfully long way toward what I think most of us would think of as critical thinking. Now, Max, you asked me on the radio the other day, are you saying you can't be a good citizen without going to college? And the answer to that is, of course not. And sadly, I know an awful lot of folks who did go to college and are not good citizens. So my point, I would never want to argue that you can't do critical thinking or you can't do good citizenship without a college degree. So yes, I think people develop good critical thinking through experience in the world, through learning the hard way that they might be wrong, right? There are other ways to get this. I think the university is a particular treasure because it teaches it in a really thoroughgoing way, tries to do so very intentionally. But no, I would never argue that you can't get there any other way.
Great, thank you for that. I have an anonymous question. It's a fairly long one, but see if we can track the different questions in here. When societies become deeply polarized and opposing factions become intolerant of the people they dislike, as we see in wider society today, don't people within universities tend to fall into the same patterns of suspicion and intolerance? Can civil discourse survive in universities when the wider society is dominated by emotionally charged polarizations, anti-intellectualism, and doubts about democracy?
Yes. Next question. So yes, there's so many pieces to try to pick apart in that question, and thank you for it. Our society is quite polarized right now. It has been quite polarized in the past, and so I think it's a little bit of a mistake to make the assumption that we are sort of worse off in that way than we've ever been before. We are quite polarized, no question. Two, can universities provide anything different, or is it inevitable that universities just reproduce that kind of emotional, intolerant style that is going on in the society at large? To my mind, the answer to that is unequivocally yes. We certainly know that in classrooms, students feel, in fact, the recent report released by several of my colleagues here at Carolina shows that students actually do feel relatively comfortable expressing unpopular views in the classroom. They're more concerned that their peers are going to judge them poorly, but they're not that concerned that faculty are going to judge them poorly if they say something that the faculty member disagrees with. We hear actually that most students think that unpopular opinions ought to be able to be expressed. And we certainly know that if we leave the world of kind of hot button political issues and we get into either the kind of more mundane questions of public policy, or frankly, let's think about things like literature or science, that we're perfectly capable of being more thoughtful, cooler, calmer, less emotional than the outside world is in those areas. We have those skills. So we ought to be able to, and we are often able to, bring those skills even to the highly emotionally charged hot button issues. I'm not arguing it's easy, and I'm not arguing that we're even most of the time successful, let alone always, but that this is the thing that we ought to be striving for, and yes, I do think it's possible.
Great, thank you for that. I have a question here from the Kuykendalls, from Bob and Kathy Kuykendall. I don't know which one wrote the question, but good friends. When a member of the audience is emotionally hurt by the comments of a speaker, what is the role of the university to promote free speech while also not traumatizing a listener?
So I'm gonna make a claim that is not going to be popular with everyone, but I think that there are relatively few speech acts that are actually traumatizing. Not to say there are none, but there are relatively few. And when I say traumatizing, I mean that they actually cause something that we might recognize as true emotional pain in the listener. When that happens, I think the person who is hurt has the right to express that hurt, has the right, the speaker has the responsibility to know that the hurt happened and to respond to it. And the university has the responsibility to seek to mitigate that hurt, right? That is, to try to prevent the pain from happening. That said, again, I think most of the time we misunderstand vigorous disagreement with actual trauma. Now, others are going to disagree with me about that. That's fine. I like it when others disagree with me. But most of the time, what's actually going on is vigorous disagreement. It's disagreement over big moral questions, big questions about right and wrong, about identity, about belonging. And that hurts in the sense that, we don't like it when people say things we really disagree with. Not we disagree with like a little bit, but we really think is wrong in value. We have to be able to have those conversations even when they're difficult and complicated. So I think in the small class of cases when there truly is something we could identify as trauma, absolutely we have to deal with it. But most of the time, the right answer to bad speech, to people saying things that are stupid or mean or problematic, is actually, it's not just the trivial thing to say is the answer to bad speech is more speech. It's not more speech, it's different speech. It's speech that actually brings evidence to that question, that actually responds in a way that adds value to it, not just sets up the alternative pole.
Great, thank you for that. I have another question, and I think this might be the final question we have time for, but this is from Elizabeth Appleby. My sample size may be small, but I've noticed the near zealous insistence among some students to be non-judgmental about most opinions, no matter how far-fetched.
Yep.
How can the university combat this aspect of anti-intellectualism and encourage the development of greater complexity of thought?
It's a great question, and my sample size is small too, but I think you're right that this lack of commitment is what I've called a lack of commitment is more worrisome than the lack of tolerance, although both of them are issues to be paying attention to. I think that what I tell you what I try to do in class when there's too much that's blasé, I try to raise the stakes. Right? I try to get students to recognize that this is a big moral question and that I want them to develop positions on it, not to be intolerant of others, but to develop a sense of right and wrong is really important, and that I want them to be engaging with it carefully, seriously. So that's what I try and do in the classroom. I think we ought to be able to use that model more generally as well. And so I'm hoping that, for example, the new program in public discourse at Carolina will try and develop some more public events that offer students that model of really vigorous, big debate on things we care about that is committed, serious, morally driven, but still tolerant.
Thank you for that. And Andy, I'm sorry I almost let you off a little too early. We actually go a little bit further on this. We're not quite done, so we have the floor till 5. We'll take questions until we no longer have them. So thank you for answering that. And I have another question from Ron Aycock. What can universities do to counter the belief that universities are bastions of liberalism and are negative towards conservatives?
Yep, a great question, and I think there's a couple pieces that we can do. Piece one is we can actually publicize the kind of boring, routine, day-to-day work that goes on in universities so that, the problem is, I think that, or part of the problem is that it's those big cases that make it to the Wall Street Journal editorial page. We know from the legal profession, big cases make bad law, right? And so people who are not usually paying attention to colleges and universities, maybe they get their alumni magazine, but mostly what they're hearing is through the sort of overfired opinion pages. It's really helpful if we can actually portray some of the day-to-day work that's going on. So the work that we do at the Institute, that you do at Carolina Public Humanities, that the program in public discourse is doing, to get the everyday work of research and education that is nonpartisan, that is relatively straightforward, and is certainly open and listening. I think that's really crucial to simply get that out into the public sphere so that it combats this idea that the coming onto a college campus is like going into a war zone. I'm also going to, I'm doing this today, but I'm also going to say something that's maybe a little unpopular with this group. We'll see. I don't know. Which is we actually have to be less intolerant of conservative voices. And the truth is, I don't think that most of the time we're shutting people down, we're freezing them out. I don't think these big kind of war-style analogies are actually true. But it is true, honestly, I think we serve our liberal students less well because we don't fully challenge their views. We don't fully force them to engage with evidence in the way that we do serve our conservative students because they feel so embattled. So I actually think that one of the solutions to this problem is, we talked before about how you probably think, I don't mean you, the question asker, but you, the audience, probably think on the one hand that everyone should talk to people they disagree with, but on the other hand, the people that you disagree with are so stupid and so beyond the pale that they really ought not be paid attention to at all. We have to actually get rid of that second view, not because it's not true. You're all right about that, by the way, no matter what side you're on. We have to actually bracket that concern and make universities actually be more tolerant to conservative viewpoints, because that's the right thing to do. That's the right way to engage with evidence in universities.
Thank you for that. And I want to just remind everyone we still have room for questions because I was going to cut it off too early. We go till 5 or until you stop having questions. So I do have another question from the Kuykendalls. How much does the Board of Governors intrude into these questions of free speech on the UNC campus?
Now you're a bit above my pay grade, so I can't offer like a true evidence-based response to that question because I just don't know. I think the evidence is strong that the Board of Governors has developed a greater interest in the day-to-day operations of the university campuses in the last number of years, and that includes, but is not limited to, or even not mostly about questions about free speech. But I think the Board of Governors is, I would say they mostly conceptualize free speech as being a question about conservatives on campus, and I think there is a level of interest. How much of one or how much, sort of interference there is, I don't really know, to be honest.
We have a question coming through on the chat from Andrea. How threatened is democracy now, given the extreme partisanship we are now seeing?
Look, it's easy to think about democracy as being in great threat, and I made my classic joke before that my book, American Democracy, could now be seen as a work of historical fiction. I think there are significant threats to democracy. I don't think they're actually mostly about polarization or partisanship. It's actually good to have people be pretty polarized, to believe seriously in what they believe in, what they are committed to. I think the things that actually threaten democracy are a couple things. One, and I'm going to foreground the one that I care most about, which is because it's about culture and society rather than about institutions. But the first of them is the lack of that public agora space, whether that's physical space or virtual space, but not having a place where people routinely engage with those they disagree with and can encounter new ideas, different ideas, ideas that are uncomfortable for them. That's a big problem. You can think about it as an information science problem. Right? You're not seeding the system with enough different kinds of new ideas. You can think about it as a culture problem, that people never get bad ideas debunked. But the fact that we don't have spaces where people are engaging with unexpected, new, different, disconfirming ideas and information, and doing so in a way that has an emotional state that they are comfortable enough to be able to do so well, that's a big problem. I think that actually does constitute a threat to democracy. And when I say democracy in that sense, it's not about the mechanisms of government. It's about the sort of, we'll call it popular sovereignty, the extent to which the people is able to govern. Requires that the people be able to form preferences, right, and opinions and beliefs as a group. And if there's no group, then we've threatened that sort of representative process. The other thing that I would now, so that's my sociology answer. Now I'll shift to a political science answer, which is more about sort of the practice of government. And I think the extent to which governing has come to be seen as essentially a game, and a game that can be played almost sort of by any legal means necessary, I think is a real problem, right? So political actors who understand their job as being to try their hardest to win for their party actually ends up being a real threat to democratic governance, even separate from the question of the public sphere. We get this with questions about gerrymandering, about vote suppression, but also with questions about bundling legislation in ways that makes it impossible to pass if you don't like it. All sorts of kind of sort of procedural tricks in the political system, but they're not done underground. They're done in the foreground because people understand sort of anything legal as being an appropriate action, and I think that is another threat.
All right, thank you for that. We have a question from our good friend Catherine Nichols from the GAA. Hello, Catherine. How is democracy impacted in a society without a public university system?
Wow, so this is like a counterfactual. What would democracy be like if we didn't have a public university system? Well, so the first answer to that is I think we would have far fewer citizens with the intellectual capabilities to and tendencies to really engage carefully with evidence and across differences and across divides. So, some empirical work I published a couple of years ago shows. I think pretty rigorously that students, the people who graduated from college are significantly more likely to vote. They're more likely to vote in off-year elections, which we think of as elections that fewer people vote in. They're more likely to volunteer in the community. And there's some less good evidence, but I think it's still pretty compelling that they're more likely to be tolerant of others across the board. So that's just college in general, not public college in particular. But we did a lot of work in that study to try to make sure we weren't just looking at the students who were likely to go to college, that we were looking at the effect of college net of who enters college. So we know that college makes, just to put a gloss on it, in general, college makes students better citizens than they would have been if they had not gone to college. We also know that public colleges are, as I said before, the vast majority of students. So if we didn't have a public university system, it follows, I think, that we would have, in general, across society, less good citizens, less willingness to vote, less interest in voting in small elections, but most importantly, less volunteering, less tolerance for others.
You know, it's interesting you say that. Just as an aside to Catherine's question, it's hard for me to imagine a country that doesn't have a public university. I'm trying to think if there is one, and certainly if there is a country that doesn't have a strong university system, it's not like it's being rivaled by a strong private university system.
Right.
So the point I would just say is it kind of proves the connection, even around the world, this understanding of the importance of a university education for citizenship.
I think that's right. Yeah, it's an interesting and difficult counterfactual that you asked, which makes it a neat question. But it's a difficult counterfactual because there really isn't a significant society that doesn't have a public university system. It's a question of how big, how much, how good, and how expensive. But not whether or not one exists.
And I'll have a counterfactual for you at the end if we have time. I have another question from Jane. You point to the historic tension between a narrow economic utilitarian view of higher education and the broader goal of producing critical thinkers and engaged citizens. Which view is winning?
Great question. I think so. The short answer is the utilitarian view is mostly winning. And when you look even at the sort of reports that come out of organizations like the Association of American Universities or some of these sort of national advocacy organizations, or even when a place like Carolina or Cal or wherever makes the case for their value to the state, most of what you hear about is economic impact, and then you hear about the employability of students coming out of those colleges and universities. And so I think the answer is in that case, right? Now, a couple of things to say. Number one, the places that are in the most demand, where we think about the places either that are able to charge these insane tuitions because they're incredibly selective and highly rigorous, places that have the highest reputations, are also the places, by and large, that are not entirely succumbing to that utilitarian view. So, in fact, I told you before about the difficulty that the sort of second and third tier private universities are having with their enrollment crises. What's interesting to me in that case is that those colleges, they engaged in kind of a race to the bottom from an intellectual standpoint. They tried to make the argument that a degree from their college would be immediately useful in the workplace, that it would get students ready for good jobs. And that's exactly the same claim that was being made by the public universities that in many cases were a few hours down the road. And so parents and students, I think, were looking at these small, not necessarily small, at these second and third tier private institutions. They were looking at tuition bills, not what you've heard about at Harvard, but still $20,000, $30,000 a year tuitions. And they're saying, why should I do that when my public university is telling me that they're going to get my kid just as good of a job coming out as well. The private institutions that are doing well, that don't have enrollment crises, the ones that your private college counselors are trying hard to get your kid into, right? Those colleges and universities are the ones that are continuing to require and even bolster humanities education, that are trying to do science education that is not just technical, but is about the epistemology and the practice of knowledge. So interestingly enough, even though the case for utilitarianism seems to be winning, the institutions that are doing the best in the marketplace are the institutions that are not succumbing to that. And then the final thing that I'll say about that is that when we talk to, and I have an opportunity to do this a lot in my job as the Institute for the Arts and Humanities director, when we talk to people in big business who are interested in hiring lots of people in the finance world, what I keep hearing from them is that we want to hire students who have great educations in the humanities and in the interpretive social sciences, because those are the ones who can do creative work. The technical work we can get done by lower level employees and by computers. That's doable. The creative work, the sort of thinking new ways, thinking strategically in conditional ways and if-then statements, that's the kind of thinking that comes out of that ideas and action cycle that we tried to develop. And so, long answer to a good question. I think the utilitarian argument is winning out, but the the less utilitarian institutions are ultimately doing better.
Great, thank you for that. I have a question in chat from our colleague Joanna Smith.
I'm just going to get some water.
Please, and I'll read the question to you as you're doing that. As you explained, it feels critical that students experience the university classroom as a place where they can engage in low-stake disagreements. Yet, as a teacher, I'm always struggling to convince my students that what we're studying in the classroom is high stakes. How can faculty navigate the tension between these two important goals?
Boy, is that a great question.
A great colleague.
Can you invite that person to give a...
This person is doing great work for Carolina Public Humanities all the time.
Fabulous. So. I think it's a great question. So I would just draw the distinction between the stakes of the argument in the classroom and the stakes of the topic being discussed. Right, so I do my other first year seminar is called Difficult Dialogues, and what I try to do with that class, essentially, we talk a little bit about how to have good dialogues across difference, and I do a lot of work to try to figure out what my students actually disagree with each other the most about, and then we spend the rest of the semester having difficult dialogues on exactly the areas that those students disagree with each other about. Those are high-stake questions. When I first started teaching that course in the early 2000s, same-sex marriage was the one that they most disagreed with one another about. They really cared about it. They really wanted to argue about it, and we had great conversations about it. Now same-sex marriage is no longer even part of the discussion, but there are other things that can be on the table. The point is not that the issues are low stakes. We should invest those issues with all the extent to which they do matter, and show them why they matter, and let them be committed and attached to them. The piece is that the argument they're going to have in the classroom is going to be low enough stakes that they can engage with it in an emotionally secure way. That when we talk about it in the classroom, we're going to talk about it with evidence, we're going to talk about it carefully, we're going to listen well to others, we're going to allow people to make mistakes and withdraw positions, right? So that it's not that the topic is low stakes, it's that having the conversation in the classroom has got to be low enough stakes that they're secure in doing it.
You know, there's it sort of goes back to a question earlier. I was thinking about the question of the dignity of work and the ubiquity of going to college because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yep.
And it feels like an unhealthy way to approach college just because I'm supposed to do it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I do also believe that, you know, you see people who get a degree in work in plumbing or something and mm-hmm. make great livings at that. But at the same time, they're missing some of this engagement with ideas. Besides touting up Carolina Public Humanities, if there is a crisis and there are going to be fewer places for higher education, either due to funding or due to colleges even closing down opportunities, these second-tier institutions that you were referring to, how can we, outside of the university, inculcate these skills of critical thinking?
Yeah.
I'm just, what is obviously I believe that Carolina Public Humanities has a role for the university to do this in public, so we'll take it. But is there any other way that perhaps graduates of universities can continue this process to give the dignity to work for people that didn't go to college, but again, get them included in these conversations, which the humanities and critical thinking and all of these important areas of becoming a full citizen? How do we do that if we don't have the university?
It's a great question, and the founder of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, Ruel Tyson, was a beloved religious studies professor, and he was famous for making these connections with folks in communities and being able to have, really interesting, difficult conversations with folks who did not have college degrees. I think that's a super important role. Whether Carolina Public Humanities is the right outlet, it's certainly one of the important outlets. I remember talking with Ruel years ago about taking things like I'm not sure if Moorhead still has the mobile science lab that they take around the state, but taking a mobile humanities lab around the state. Probably shouldn't call it humanities, but let's call it, let's just call it Mobile Carolina or something. Carried around the state, have great conversations where people who are hungry for big thoughts can be met and not, as you say, dignity to work, not sort of shamed for not having the college background, but given the opportunity to engage even for a short time through those ways. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. I also want to, again, just shout out to Joanna Smith for doing that work as our state outreach coordinator, responsible for that. All we need now is a bus. We'll work on it.
There you go.
We'll get it. So I want to go to our dear friend Lloyd Kramer, who has a question for you, Dr. Perrin. You noted the great decline in funding for public education, and the crisis is likely to grow in the time of COVID. How would you explain to legislatures that we need advanced work in the humanities and the liberal arts, and that funding should be increased to support such work? Is there a way to challenge anti-humanistic views as well as anti-intellectualism?
Yes, there is. Look, one of the things I like about this work is that it's a hard case to make, not an easy case to make, right? And I think it's important to make those hard cases. But yes, I think there's a really important case to be made. One point to be made is the reason we have universities and the reason that those universities study every possible topic under the sun, and we try to develop expertise in every possible topic under the sun, is the truth is that we never know which of those topics is going to suddenly turn out to be really important. There's a fairly technical field within sociology called social network analysis. We study things like social capital and where people get information, stuff like that. Turns out that social network analysis has been super important in trying to understand the solutions to the two biggest things that have happened in the last couple of decades. One was trying to understand terrorist networks and 9/11, and two is trying to understand the spread of disease and the pandemic given people's social patterns and social engagements, right? So if you had said in 1995 that we need to invest in high-level social network analysis techniques and in the theory of human behavior that's implemented in social networks, you would have had to make it in the register that Dr. Kramer is talking about now. This is esoterically interesting. It's an interesting theory. It's something that we ought to be developing expertise in just because expertise is good. Now it turns out that expertise is really important, and it's absolutely crucial to understanding not just whether masks work, but when they work, when people are going to use them, how they're going to learn to behave in particular ways in a pandemic. So the first answer is anyone who tells you what kind of knowledge is going to be necessary even 5 years from now, they just don't know what they're talking about. We actually have no idea what kind of knowledge is going to be useful on the ground. But that's a utilitarian argument, right? That's not the intellectualism argument. The intellectualism argument is that it's not only about knowledge, it's about the patterns of thought. It's about students and the public being able to approach new questions and new content, new ideas, and to do so in a flexible, serious way, engaging with evidence and engaging with good argument. That's what comes from studying the humanities. Students who study the humanities and who study it in an advanced, in a deep way, and scholars who study the humanities have that capacity for intellectual flexibility that is going to be, it's the only thing that's going to be of particular value moving forward and coming out of this crazy year of 2020. So I actually think, maybe we can close on this claim, I actually think that if there is if this society is to survive and flourish following 2020, it's going to be because of public universities. It's going to be because of, and it's not just going to be because of the sciences, it's going to be because of the intellectual capacities and the complexity of thought that you encounter really only in universities, and the vast majority of that is in public universities. And so it's societal flourishing is the answer to Dr. Kramer's question.
Well, we are not going to disagree with that, and I want to thank, let's all put our virtual hands together for Dr. Can you hear the applause?
I can hear it, yes.
You can hear the applause. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thanks so much for everyone here, and thanks for your great questions. Really had a lot of fun.